We have three speakers tonight. The first is Richard, whom you can see up there. He's slipped out of the way a bit, and he's waving there now, and his first slide is there. We're very pleased to have Richard here tonight. Richard is an engineer, consultant, and author with a particular interest in renewable energy and energy efficiency. He has master's degrees in both engineering, electronics, and environment energy efficiency. He was a leader author of the Zero Carbon Australia Buildings Plan and has regularly contributed to the ATA's or Renewed publications, which is called Alternative Technology Association, now Renewed. Renewed publications on topics related to energy efficiency. Richard is sitting in Melbourne, where he lives, with his family in their zero carbon home, and is the author of the book, The Energy Freedom House, published by Scribe. So thank you for being the first presenter tonight, Richard, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and to Ross. I'm getting a bit of feedback on the audio there. That will persist. Okay. Phase change materials for high performance buildings. That's thanks for the invitation to speak on this. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. It's no doubt a lot colder here in Melbourne than it is there in Toowoomba. So let's see how this technology works. Okay, phase change materials. What's the theoretical appeal of phase change materials? Well, they give extra thermal mass effect, and they do so with relatively light weight. So that's the theory, which begs the question, what's the benefit of extra thermal mass? Well, so I'm going to start this talk off by just doing a bit of a refresh, a drill down into why people view thermal mass as a beneficial thing, and then we'll relate that back to phase change materials. Thermal mass slows down the response to changing temperature. So that's in a nutshell. So let's talk about thermal mass. So if you apply heat to a material, it increases in temperature. If you take heat out of that material, it goes down in temperature. So in the case of water, that increase in temperature is proportional to the amount of heat you apply. That if you take the same amount of air, or 1 kilogram of it, you get a different response because those materials respond differently to heat in them. So in the case of water, 4.2 kilojoules of heat added is going to change the temperature by 1 degree Celsius, whereas with air you only need about 1 kilojoule of heat energy to change the temperature by 1 degree. So that makes a number of points about materials and heat. One is, if you look at that line, in the case of water, that having a low slope, the lower the slope on this chart corresponds to higher thermal mass. So in other words, the more heat you need to add to get a certain amount of change, that's what high thermal mass is all about. And this way that materials respond to heat in physics and engineering terms is called sensible heat. In other words, the change that's in direct proportion to the amount of heat, the change in temperature in direct proportion to the amount of heat applied. And that's in particular in characterizing materials, that slope that's characteristic of the material, we call a specific heat of the material. So in the case of water, that's 4.2 kilojoules per degree of change per kilogram of material. So that's a way of characterizing a material in terms of its response to heat added or removed. So let's think about that in terms of a sudden change in temperature. So we've got the blue line representing a notional stimulus. It's a change in outside temperature, for example, and the red line represents, let's say it's the inside temperature in response to that outside temperature change. And This is a hypothetical step change in temperature, which isn't a realistic one, but it makes the point that you get that sort of curved response like that characteristic asymptote up to the final temperature. And in a more realistic example, it looks like this. So if blue is the outside temperature going up and then coming back down, you can see three examples, with the red line being low thermal mass, yellow being medium, and the green being high. So you can see what's different here in these three scenarios in response to the same temperature stimulus is what we call the thermal response time. So the high thermal mass takes a long time to respond. The low thermal mass changes temperature very quickly. So this type of thinking has got big implications in terms of how buildings respond to changes in temperature. We also want to put the thermal mass in context with insulation, because I think there's some misunderstandings about thermal mass versus insulation out there. I think there's a bit of a myth out there that high thermal mass gives you insulation, and it's important to reflect that they're very different things. Secondly, I think there's a view out there that insulation improvements don't help slow down thermal response. So in other words, there's a view that slowing down the thermal response is the job of thermal mass, and insulation doesn't help there. But I don't think that's the case. So in reality, the thermal response time is actually a function of the mass multiplied by the insulation. So for example, hypothetically, if you halve the mass and double the insulation, you'll end up with the same thermal response time as you started with. Or looked at another way, doubling the insulation and doubling the thermal mass can have the same proportional impact on the thermal response time. So in other words, thermal mass and insulation together are what give a longer thermal response time. So thermal mass is mostly beneficial when you've got high temperature variation. Diurnal in this case means during the day. So if you've got a high variation across the course of a day based on your location, then thermal mass is going to help you. And the thermal mass is going to help you if the mass itself is within a temperature range that corresponds to your comfort zone, arguably 19 to 26 degrees or so. So the effect is that the thermal mass averages out the inside temperature, and that generally works in your favor. But thermal mass might not always be so good for you. So imagine if your starting temperature is too cold. Perhaps it's a winter scenario in southern Australia, you've been away for a while and you're coming back to a cold house. In that situation, high thermal mass works against you because it needs a lot of time and energy to get comfortable. Another scenario in a heat wave situation, the thermal mass buffering capability of the material gets overwhelmed, so that the material gets too hot and the benefits are gone once that temperature is too high or too low. So thermal mass is not good when the thermal mass's temperature is outside your comfort zone. So that's a bit of a recap on thermal mass. Let's now bring this to phase change materials. To understand phase change materials, we have to understand the notion of a phase change. So let's take a material that goes from frozen. Initially, you increase the temperature. Let's say it's water at 0 degrees. It melts, and then you keep adding energy, and you get to 100 degrees, and it boils. So that's two different phase changes. So melting and freezing boundary, that's one phase change. Evaporating and condensing boundary, that's a second phase change. So phase change reflects this change of state from solid to liquid or liquid to gas. And what's important in that regard is that changing phase involves latent heat, and let's explore what that means. I'll explain the idea of latent heat in the context of an example with ice and water. So imagine we're starting off with ice, and we're adding heat energy to that, and so this is sensible heat change. So we're adding a bit of heat energy, and we're bringing the temperature up from something below zero, and the temperature increasing is in direct proportion to the amount of heat we add. But then it reaches our melting point, the 0 degrees, and then we keep adding heat, and instead of continuing along that line, the temperature stays the same despite the fact that we're adding more heat. We keep adding heat, we keep adding heat, we keep adding heat, and the temperature doesn't change at all. Then suddenly it's fully melted, and then lo and behold, the temperature starts going up again. So that flat bit there, that's the phase change, and that heat added across that phase change is the latent heat. Okay, so we've talked about that in terms of going from ice to water, but the same thing works in reverse. As we take heat away, the temperature drops initially and then doesn't change anymore as it's solidifying, and then it continues back down. So as we're dropping that temperature, the material is losing heat to the environment, and that's the latent heat coming back out. And once all that latent heat's come out, then the temperature drops below zero. So that's the idea, and it's the same sort of concept at boiling as well, as we go from liquid to gas. So in the case of going from ice to water, that latent heat change needs 334 kilojoules for every kilogram. And in the case of going from liquid water to steam, it needs even more. It needs about 2.3 megajoules per kilogram. And remember, the specific heat of water is only 4.2 kilojoules per kilogram for every degrees change. So this is a heck of a lot more heat than that specific heat value. So that's why it's important. So which brings us to phase change materials that take advantage of these phase changes. So phase change materials use that melting freezing phase change that we're talking about. And just to put that in context, everyone uses fridges, and presumably you've all got air cons as well. Well, refrigerants use phase change as well. They use that evaporation condensing phase change. So our society is full of these gadgets that already use phase change physics to our advantage, and PCMs in buildings are another example of that. As it relates to the use of phase change materials in the skin of buildings, to be useful, the melting point needs to be within the comfort range of humans. So water by itself, it melts at zero, not very useful as a phase change material in the thermal envelope of the house. The other point about phase change materials is because they change between solid and liquid, you can't just use them in their bare form. You have to encapsulate them. They've got to be, you don't want this stuff running everywhere once it melts. So they're typically in some sort of encapsulation involving pouches or cells, or sheets of some kind. They can be balls in tanks of water, for example. So, but in any case, you need some sort of encapsulation. So then to be effective, the phase change material needs to be used in a context where you've got these high daily temperature variations, and those temperature variations need to vary across the melting freezing point of the material. And that's because the benefit comes from that stored latent heat, which you only get advantage of when you melt and freeze the material. So because of that need to have a high diurnal temperature swing to get the best out of this, it often rules out a coastal application. You know, many of you will be aware that you typically see high diurnal temperature variations in inland locations. Coastal situations, you tend to get a much lower range of temperature throughout the course of a day. It also rules out places where it's consistently too hot or too cold. So you're not going to be able to thermally recharge your phase change material if the outside temperature doesn't vary across that range. So if it's consistently too hot or consistently too cold, then the phase change material is not going to help you. So here's that same sort of chart we saw in the example of water before, but applied to a practically useful phase change material. For the sake of this example, it's a product called BioPCM, which I'll talk more about in a minute. In this example, the melting point temperature, for the sake of the example, let's call it 23 degrees. And you've got that same characteristic notch in the curve, which in the case of water was about 430 kilojoules per kilogram of material. In the case of BioPCM, it's less than half that, about a third of that. It's 150. So it's still a useful amount of heat energy, but not as good as water. So remember I said before that the slope of the line, or the average slope of the line, if it's lower, it corresponds to high thermal mass. If it's steeper, it corresponds to low thermal mass. Well, in use, you can think of that the fact that a line is completely flat as almost having infinite thermal mass across that very narrow band of temperature. So if we arguably have let's call that a 3-degree band of temperature, then you have that that dotted line there showing a much flattened out average between this point here and this point here. So in other words, the effective average thermal mass across that temperature range is much higher than either up here given by this slope or down here given by this slope. So in other words, we're getting effective increase in thermal mass across that melting, freezing range of temperature, but not outside. So if the temperature is only varying up here or down here, then we don't have effective high thermal mass. So I mentioned BioPCM. That's one of the practical available products available on the Australian market. It's an American product from Phase Change Energy Solutions. BioPCM, it uses organic oil-based compounds as the phase change material. It's encapsulated in pouches or sheets. I've got a sheet of it here with me. So as you can see, it's a plastic encapsulation. It's got little pouches on the back. And at the moment, it's less than 23 degrees in this room. These are solid. They're a chalky texture. I can break them up with my fingers in the pouches. And if I was to open the pouch, they would look like plasticine, but hard. So these sheets are deliberately sized to fit within about the same form factor as an insulation bat. So it's about 450 mil wide. It's about 1 meter long. So you can imagine sticking it between an insulation bat and a ceiling. These used to come in various different grades and densities, but now the importers really only importing one that's 2.7 kilograms per square meter. It costs about $110 a square metre, which, to put that in context, is in the order of 10 times the price for the product compared with insulation. The Australian supplier is Phase Change Energy Solutions. They're in Melbourne. And the manufacturer claims, and because it's American, they do BTUs over there, 51 BTUs per square foot, which in our speak is about half a megajoule per square metre of latent heat storage. The other newer product on the market, which I haven't actually had the chance to handle, but I've spoken to the importers, it's called Infinite R. And it, unlike the bio-PCM, it's an inorganic compound. It's basically a blend of clay and salt and water. So it's encapsulated in a similar way, similar use cases as the bio-PCM, and it's available from ETS in Melbourne. So they claim 100 BTUs per foot squared, which is a bit over 1.1 megajoules per metre squared. And so it's cheaper, and in theory, better value for money. I've not, I don't have or know anyone with direct personal experience of this one. So jury's out a bit as to its utility. There are other forms of PCMs used in buildings. These two are deliberately designed to be of a form that you can fit within the thermal envelope. So the example I gave before was putting it within a sandwich sort of configuration between your insulation and your plaster wall lining or ceiling. Obviously, it's going to fit better on a ceiling because it's held against the ceiling under its own weight. So you're not getting an air gap between it and the plasterboard, and then you just sit the insulation over the top of it. You can imagine in a wall situation or a floor situation, you've got to go to a bit more trouble to try and make sure that the material is in close contact with the plasterboard. There used to be a type of plasterboard which had a PCM material built into the plaster, but that's no longer available in Australia. I think the importer tried it, but it wasn't commercially successful. So they're the products available on the market. There is other ways you can use PCMs in conjunction with the design of more exotic heating and cooling systems. For example, I'm aware of ice slurry used as a phase change material in a hot climate air conditioning context, where you might, for example, throw a lot of energy into chilling a tank of water ice into a slurry to hold cool energy when that daytime solar energy might be cheap, and then if you still need the cooling when you don't have the cheap electricity, you can then keep on cooling by just using a simple heat exchanger through the ice slurry to work as a chiller. So I've seen that in a couple of examples. I'm aware of a good example in Darwin. There's also an example I've seen here in Melbourne, or a couple of examples in Melbourne of that. But it's still extremely rare. These are quite exotic and unusual configurations. Yeah, so that's what we spoke about. So that ends up giving you chilled water. So that's just an example of using water as a phase change material, but it's not the sort of thing you can use in the thermal envelope of your house. So in conclusion, my personal view is insulation is far more fundamental than thermal mass. Thermal comfort benefits are usually achievable by other means. PCMs are very expensive. So again, reiterating what I said, that per square metre, these phase change materials are about 10 times more expensive than insulation. So for the price of PCM, you can stick a hell of a lot of insulation in a thermal envelope and still end up with change in your pocket compared to putting phase change materials in. But there are cases I recognise where phase change materials might have value. So you might have a case where the design requirements are to achieve, exceptional performance, and you need a bit of phase change material in there to just go that extra mile in getting the thermal performance that you need, that you can't get by other means. That might be a case where, for design, the design spec might be to achieve a house that can work without any active heating or cooling. And in that case, it might be worth the extra expense to put PCMs in. Maybe the need is structural. Maybe you need to achieve the thermal mass effect with less weight, for cost or other structural reasons. It might be important to take that mass out of the structure and get the thermal mass without the actual mass. So there's some examples where I think PCMs make sense today, but generally I'm not really a fan. So that's it. Thanks for your attention, and yeah.
Oh, good evening, everyone.
I'll introduce Geoff.
Oh, yeah,
right. A builder. Geoff's built his first home in 1989, so he's been building them for a while. He designs quality and customs homes with a reputation for optimising energy efficiency. And other people have recognised him for the way homes which he's built. He's a green smart professional, and he won the Queensland HIA winner for the 9-star house Satori, which you may have gone through out along Hempcrete. And that year, he was a finalist in the National Green Smart Awards. That was 2017 he did that. Geoff continues to build homes. He says he will achieve 7-star rating, and the minimum is about 4.5.
When you correlate it down to what the real efficiency is, yeah,
4.5 stars. So he says he can build 7 stars with only a 10% input cost, and your home would be something like 80% more energy efficient. Anyway, please welcome Geoff.
Right, well, I'll just start with the Green Smart. That's an educational course run for the Housing Industry Association. That actually gives you an overview of, for a start, energy efficiency, sustainability, increasing the air quality in the house, correcting erosion, and also looking at waste management. So it's a general tool, and I did several of those courses about 10 years ago, and that's where I changed my tact in building. And then, and generally it's just common sense. Now, not rocket science. As this slide will show you, we've got the most of the house with the northern aspect. It's just pace the house in the right direction, and we're 50% there with our energy efficiency. So from that, and then if we can just look at the rooms inside that house to give you an overview of what we're looking at, you'll see the pink marked walls. They were all thermal mats. So they were either reverse veneer or they were solid block walls to increase thermal mass. So that's where this material, I've been trying to find an alternative to the extra cost and the space required for that thermal mass. So that's where, about 3 years ago, when I was at the Green Smart Awards in Melbourne, looking at structuring companies that are using the phase change material. So and then the layout, well, this one here, that's what the average Queensland house is using power-wise, about 109 megajoules per square metre. So if we go to the next screen, in our climate zone 2, which is Toowoomba, climate zone 5, sorry, 2 is down the range. So 5, we will easily get to 40 megajoules. So reduce that power consumption by what, nearly 30% of what the normal house would be. And all we're doing to get that is point the house in the right direction and insulate the walls correctly. So that's it. So it's not rocket science. This is a predictive energy assessment, and what you need to look at here also is the actual carbon. I'll say 200 green smart houses, we would say probably that'd be 200 by 6, 1,200 tonnes of carbon, less have gone in the atmosphere, just simply by putting the house in the right direction and insulating it correctly. So it's very simple. And the cost of that is probably not 10%. I think we're just doing that, the orientating the house is nothing, just with a thought. Then insulating the house correctly might add $2,000 to the house. So if you're looking at a $300,000 house, so what it's a fraction of a percent. It's 0.75% of the cost. So it's not a lot of cost, it's just a bit of thought. And that, as Richard said, is the main thing, insulating that house correctly, orientating it correctly. We'll go through the next slide. Ooh, very small.
Come back to mute his microphone. Because I was going to have no.
Right.
Oh, Richard.
Now, this is the thermal mass used inside that house. You can see it, solid brick, and that took up a lot of space. And you imagine, we use about 10 square metres of floor area space in that house. We've got a very good result out of it. We've got a 9-star house. 9-star house is that one stage better, that you're really not depending on a lot of outside power at all. But 10 square metres of house, that's probably $15,000 of space, let alone the cost of the brickwork. So that's where that phase change, in a practical point of view, comes back to, yes, it's expensive for a piece of plastic, but what it's replacing, it is probably very cost efficient against. And as Richard also said, it is not something you use generally. It's if you really want to push that to that next level, getting up to that 9-star, or even possibly the 10-star. 10-star where there's no outside energy required. Then we, like when you see that finished, that brick wall was just encased in that wall. So you're losing that space, and then you've got the cost of actually doing that. Where do we go from there? Well, that's the most important thing of all, insulating the house. And even the outdoors, you can see here, we're putting R5 insulation out in the patio. We're putting R5 right through the house. And that extra cost on top of the standard house is still only about $2,000 for the insulation side of it. And then fully insulating all the external walls, insulating the wall between the garage and the house, and then sealing the outside openings. Making sure the door has a door seal and has a foam strip seal on the door between the house and the garage and all the external doors. They calculate that'll increase the efficiency of your conditioning of the house by 10% for a $25 seal. So, there's a lot of things there you can do, make a big difference without spending, $20,000 in phase charge. But imagine if someone said, I can increase the efficiency of your house by 10%, but it'll cost you $25. There wouldn't be many people that would have got their hands up at that. And that was, we went on our western exposure, we went totally overboard with insulation. We had air cell, which is a composite insulating product. Then we had cavity. Then we had another row of insulation, and then we had our thermal mass inside. But that's where I'm looking at this material, is going, that's also a solid block wall that we put inside the house to increase the thermal mass. So we took a house that would have been, say, 7.5 stars to 9 by the extra thermal mass inside. Now, that has changed the energy consumption by probably another 20%. And that 20% doesn't sound much, but you added that up over the 50-year life of the house, there might be another $1,000 a year, $50,000. That's the way power is at the moment, but that's forever. Like if you design it correctly, insulate it correctly, that's not something that wears out, that's there forever. And that's where I'm thinking, especially in Toowoomba, in a climate zone 5, where we have a great fluctuation in temperatures, most nights it will get cool, it would recharge this, and then it's there to work for you again the next day. If you, as Richard pointed out, on a coastal climate where it will possibly never get to a point that it then gets back solid again because it stays too warm. In Toowoomba, we'll have most of the time the ceiling temperature will get back to below 20. This will recharge. These capsules inside here that are made up from soy and the leftovers from palm oil. So it's the mixture of the two. This one's set at 24 degrees centigrade. So, and then you have different ones for different parts of Australia. These are the ones we're using at the moment. Where it will go is the high parts of the wall in the living area. So we'll put from the ceiling down around the wall. This is the main living area, and then would insulate behind it, and then the ceiling area that will lay on the ceiling, and then the insulation goes on top. And it's designed with a very convenient width that will fit neatly in between our studs. And 2 layers of that will fit neatly in between our trusses. But I suppose this is more when you want to push it that little bit further, and I can see the design work and the cost in lifting our thermal mass, that would have been about half the cost. Now, whether it would have been quite as effective, because thermal mass works over a bigger temperature range. This, as Richard pointed out, has a window of use. So the thermal mass will help us right through those temperature ranges. But $100 a metre as thermal mass, I would think maybe $300 a metre. So it'd be a fairly simple choice there, I would have thought. And you've got 20 mil thick, so it fits neatly in your wall and you won't even know. We don't need questions at this point.
Yeah,
basically,
we can take questions now. Have you got more you wanted to show us?
No, it was basically, giving you where the thought of this has come from. Because I used the thermal mass to get a very good effect, but I thought, oh, well, the one detriment from it is the structural requirements, because you've got a solid brick wall, so therefore you need a foundation underneath it. You've got space that it takes, and then the cost of getting it there. So when you add that all together, it's probably nearly $300 a metre, where this, as Richard said, maybe 100, depends how much of the house you do, the price will come down, but it still won't get below $100 a metre. Very simple to fit, so that's not a big cost comparative. Not like bricks that you need a bricklayer to put them in place. The insulating contractor can just lay them out before he puts his insulation in.
So, can I just ask a question? So, you talked about hanging from the ceiling down in the wall, but you're not going all the way to the floor.
No, you get the best effect in the high part of the room, with the high parts of the room where the temperature is high. That's what the science is telling us. I only go by what the experts tell me will work, and over the last 10 years, they've been very correct. The Satori that we built in Hume Street. I spoke to the owners of the house about 6 months after we'd handed over to them, and we went right through how it went through our last hot summer, and we had temperatures 36 degrees in Toowoomba, which is really hot. They had not a situation that even turned on the fan, so it was just beautiful and comfortable the whole time. and that was pushing it to the 9-star. 8-star would still work very well, but 9-star got to the point where air conditioner, they didn't know if it worked or not because they hadn't turned it on. They were a Scottish couple as well, so maybe it might have something to do with it. But I think it was more that, yes, it was comfortable and they didn't need the extra movement of air. And by orientating the house correctly, also we're picking up the correct breezes as well. So that was, proof that, the science works, that we put this work in to get to a 9-star. And the energy assessment told us that would be the result, and it certainly was. We went right through a cold winter and a hot summer, and no external energy was required to keep that room comfortable. Now, if we had a 20-day heat wave, which may be coming up, we don't know, then maybe you might have to then add some energy to get to a comfortable point. But when you got back to a comfortable point, the thermal mass or this would then help make it difficult for that room to change. They've done tests of 87 years. Now, this is computer simulations that are material, but 87 years. So I think that'll do most of it. It's totally recycled everything in there. So that's why it's probably a little bit more expensive than the other one of us suppose. It was.
You mentioned 24 degrees. I lost the thought there. What was that?
Right, 24 degrees that's when that is designed to go from solid to liquid. That's its phase change.
The room is hotter than that. What is that doing?
It's absorbing that. Now, when the room is colder than that, it's releasing that. So it's basically like a little battery there. You need it. It takes power in. You don't. It takes releasing it out. And these same manufacturers will make it in different ranges. Like if you're rock camping or maybe inland, then therefore you have a one with 27 degrees phase change, right down to 21 degree phase change.
Do that with salt?
The others are, yes. This is all. This is just plant extract. And my concern possibly was rupturing these pockets, but if you rupture the pocket, you've got the soil in the water. So it's not a big deal. And we can cut out little pockets if we have electrical connections and that sort of thing around it. It doesn't have to be continuous like insulation. Insulation has to be fully continuous with nearly airtight gap. This, we just need to cover about 80% of that area. So you can have big gaps around your light fittings, around, say, fans, power points, without a detriment to the effect of it. I certainly do between the garage and the house. The other internal walls, no. I'll do the full external wall, the full envelope, and the wall between the garage and the house, because you'll have, so you'll come home in the evening, your car will have components of that 400, 500 degrees centigrade, and that's trying to pump that in. So we insulate that wall as well. Internal walls, it will help. So, say if you just had a area, a central living area that you wanted comfortable, yes, it would help. And then that means, say, your air conditioner, if you're conditioning them, would be limited to that space and it would work so much better. But you definitely do the whole ceiling, and Toowoomba, R3.5 is the minimum you'd use, possibly even R5. R5 is about 200 mil thick, so you make sure the electrician's finished before you put it in. And the internal walls, I would probably look at maybe an acoustic bat that has also insulation capability. So therefore you're reducing the noise penetration from that noisy living area to your bedrooms, and as well as helping.
Just thinking that a lot of us would be more interested in retrofitting existing houses. So you can't do a lot of.
Very simple with this. You can do your whole ceiling.
Yeah. So when you were talking about cost, then it'd be nice to know what the payback is for these sorts of.
Unfortunately, the computer programs aren't yet recognising this material. It's too advanced for them as yet. So your CSIRO program or your FIRS program don't recognise that yet, but the science is still there. I would think put the money into insulation first, and that will make a huge difference. And this would be like the cherry on the top of the cake. You would start with the insulation, and this underneath that insulation. The project where this is going into in the next few weeks will be centre of the house in a raking ceiling, and we've got high walls both sides. So the high walls and the raking ceiling, that material will go right through. We've been unable to get the house to the space that I'd be happy with the energy efficiency, because we've got veranda right the way around the house, which is keeping the winter sun out. The rest of the house is very good, but the winter will be a bit of a problem where I think that will help. So that's why we've particularly said, right, you want your veranda, but I still want it to get better than it is now. So that's our suggestion. Much cheaper than, say, a suspended concrete ceiling, which will give you the same effect. The thermal mass of the concrete will give you that effect, but the cost would be much more.
Can I just interrupt for a minute, Geoff? Look, there's obviously a lot of questions on this, and we might be going all night. Richard, are you still hearing in Melbourne?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Have you got any comments on the question so far? Just speak up if you have. Or has anybody got a question for Richard and Melbourne? But not at this stage.
There was one point that did come to mind, Mark, and I didn't emphasise that it's a good thing with phase change material that the effective thermal mass outside that comfort band is low. In other words, if the temperature gets outside your comfort band, if you're dealing with a solid masonry wall, then it takes as much energy to get it down, let's say from 30 degrees back down to 25 degrees as it does for the next 5 degrees. But with a phase change material, if you need to get the temperature back down, you don't need as much energy. So if you're using this in conjunction with heating and active heating and cooling, then yeah, the fact that it behaves like a low thermal mass material outside its melting point boundary but a high thermal mass across that boundary, that works in your favour. Whereas you've got that high thermal mass effect regardless of the temperature in the case of a masonry wall.
Thanks, Richard. Listen, I think we could be going a fair while here. Maybe 3 more questions. 1, 2, not on to this side. And you have a lady at the back.
That possibly in high humidity areas, not so much here. Like maybe in Melbourne, coastal areas, yes, but Toowoomba, it wouldn't be as big a concern. I've never had a problem with insulation and the build-up of humidity. And the problem with the timber home probably is getting access to that ceiling to insulate it. But the ceiling is the best place for the insulation. The walls are a plus. But obviously, it's not going to be very difficult to do the walls now.
Can I just make a comment on that? My understanding is that if you've got a 19 mil in the ceiling, it's not going to be anywhere near effective as say plasterboard timber.
No.
Because the 19 mil of the timber is going to insulate it.
For the phase change, yes, definitely the phase change. The timber is a really good disperser of energy. Where the plasterboard would be better, but still the insulation. We'll forget about the phase change, but the insulation is what should be in that ceiling. Yeah. And the phase change would be a bonus, but as pointed out, it won't be as effective with the timber ceiling. Yes. Minimal, because we looked at some rooms in that have the satori. We did some rooms with exposed brick and some we put plaster over. And when you looked at the actual comfort of those rooms, they were very similar. Not enough that you'd notice the difference. But yes, obviously the plaster would have dissipated that thermal mass effect somewhat, but not enough that you'd feel that difference.
Last question was over here.
I'm just wondering if you said that on the site. I'm just wondering if you
I tell you, worry about that in 87 years. It's designed to go in your ceiling and not come out. But everything in that is recyclable according to the manufacturer. And everything in the actual manufacturer is from recycled material.
It should be right for about 87 years.
87 years, and I'm sure that they will be able to distribute that out because it is an encapsulated pocket that can be moved. It's really good for fire. It actually is fire resistant. If it does, if you have flame on it, it will actually dissipate the flame, according to the manufacturer. I haven't been up in the ceiling and lit fire, but it actually is a flame suppressor.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's through Phil, who's been involved a bit with Hempcrete, done a Hempcrete training, and very interested in the not the phase change, but the life change material. So yeah, let's hit it off. Quick program. So we'll talk about myself. It's already done. Then we'll talk about hemp, the material, the plant hemp a little bit. Then we go into Hempcrete because it's a product that you can make from hemp and hemp products. Then we'll talk about building with hemp, the options we have, and of course the Hempcrete block, which I'm designing or have designed. All right. So first of all, I thought you guys have to feel what's going on and know about hemp. Before I pass these things, I'll explain a little bit. Hemp is a plant which is the same family as hopper plant. So if we make beer, we kind of make hemp drink, the same family. There's three types of hemp. There's sativa, there's the indica, and the rudalis. It's because if you take that plant, you'll become very rude. So there are the three main families of hemp. The rudalis and the sativa are the ones that we work with, and that is called an industrial hemp. There's a lot of talk about hemp. Everyone's seen hemp and hempcrete or hemp and marijuana and confusing this and that. In the end, the industrial plant will contain 0.2% of THC, which you will need a lot of leaves of to get any effect, hallucinating effects. So it's a safe industrial plant which has been used over centuries. It's one of the fastest growing plants, actually the second fastest growing plant in the world after. So yeah, hemp grows very close together, can have about 10 tons of yield, which means stalk and the fiber over a hectare, and will create more carbon. Is it 20 or 40 times? No, 40 times. Hold on, let me get that right. I'm not very good with numbers. Let me get that right. It will create 4 times more carbon than a forest over a hectare. Right? So, who's familiar with hemp of any kind here? Yeah, I'm not taking numbers or names. So, yes, so hemp has had a very long history. We all lived on hemp. Hemp was, at one stage, was actually a currency you pay in hemp in another civilization. And hemp is a very old plant that's been pushed to the side because it's too good to be true and it has a fantastic benefits. And then we're talking about the fiber, which is on the outside of the plant, and the wood, which is on the inside. So I'll pass this around. This is a bit of hemp. When we go that way, or pass here. When when we decorticate, take the cord out of that plant, just rip it off, we end up with a fiber, which is this. Take it out, have a feel of it, which is familiar. Will be in clothing, will be in sails, will be in ropes. You know the story. Hemp fiber is being used all over the place. And the wood, which is the inner core, is this stuff. This is a fine part of the wood. You can have it a bit rougher, just similar to those particles there. And when we mix the wood together with a lime, not cement, then we get a creek. We get that's one of the parts. I'm not going to skip too much. And work with the slides that I have here. Close that. And let's have a look at some pictures so you don't get bored looking at my face. What I wanted to actually also mention is that the reason why I'm here and the reason why we're all here is because we kind of have interest in making a change of the standard way of going. We all consume a lot of petrol, energy, unnecessary things, and we'd like to look at options to change our lifestyle and where we live, our environment. You look very familiar. Are you? Yeah, you look very familiar. No? No, behind you. No. Yeah. No, you don't recognize me? Okay, that's good. I thought it was an industry person now that is catching up. All right, where were we? So we try to make a change to make a livable, nice environment for ourselves and a healthy one. So hemp will help. That's why I think we love our planet and we should take care of her. GeoSIP, which is my company, believes that we can make a change if we choose the right materials to build with and to have a phase change materials inside the walls made out of natural materials, perhaps in conjunction with yours as well. So we've seen the hemp plant. Hemp is getting more and more popular. The licenses to grow hemp in Australia are getting easier to get for farmers, so the farmers can invest in getting that thing going. Here we see hemp bales. So Europe and Russia are very advanced to use hemp fibers, mainly for the car industry and the paper industry. China is getting on with hemp, but processes the hemp still with a lot of labor, with a lot of hand power. All right, there we go. That's the hemp wood you have in your hands and a bit more fiber. And the other thing we can make out of it is edible material, which is oil, food, or seed, proteins. It's got fantastic omega properties and so on. And the whole food thing and the CBD thing and the THC thing, the medicinal hemp, that is a whole world by itself. Once you study the different plants and the different properties of the different THCs and so on, and oils. Yeah, it's a pretty magical plant. Here's the hemp wood, and here's the lime. So we went through that very quickly. What's hemp? Hemp particles, and then we come to the hempcrete. So hempcrete is made out of hemp wood and lime mixed with a bit of water in the right constitution, in the right mix. So it's kind of sticky, like a porridge, not wet, not heavy as concrete, still light and pliable. That's it there. So the mixer you saw beforehand is we chuck it in, add some water, add the lime. It's a specific lime, we call a lime binder, to make sure that the hemp particles don't freeze, so to speak, and don't clog up, so that the little particles that are in there can still perform their actions. Because that little bit of wood is capilla and has lots of holes in it and tubes and all kinds of complicated mechanisms that allow the humidity to transfer into the wood and out of the wood. So it's a phase change kind of material in that regard. And hemp is the only material that does that with its best performance. Hardwood is similar in structure, but doesn't have the same microorganisms and micro setup. Here we are doing a prefabricated Hempcrete wall, which this company in Holland is now producing full walls to create Hempcrete houses. And that works. I press enter. Nope. That doesn't work. Well, anyway, that's a little video. And I've pumped the material as well. I've got a special pump in to bring the mass from the mixer to the wall. In principle, we'll see that later here. That's the block. We'll come back to that later. So here you see formwork. This is a plastic formwork system and a stud wall on the inside. And as the formwork is open, we'll pour the Hempcrete and tamp it on. The video doesn't work because you can see the anyway, I had to go from Mac to thingy, Mac to we'll tamp it on. We don't ram it, just like rammed earth. We'll tamp it on so the light is the wall has still a light dense structure, and that's it. We'll let it dry. The form can go up straight away after we put it in, and that is because this has zero slump, meaning it won't bulge out like concrete. It's not heavy. It was nice to stick together. We can bring the form up and fill the walls up till the ceiling. There we go. This is a wall, penthouse in Caloundra, Sunshine Coast. There it is in scaffold. So you can understand this was 2 stories. We had to mix it downstairs where you see the sign about there and mixed it. And then we brought it up with the baskets and put it inside the walls there and later on pumped it. But pumping was still quite intensive and slow. And therefore we went to the basket. Hand labor was fast. So that's the finished wall there. A few more Hempcrete houses. This is in WA of colleagues. And a display center we build in Sunshine Coast as well. So, after being part of Hempcrete Australia and bringing Hempcrete to the masses, how to speak, to bringing it into the ABCB, the certification, getting it to the point that everyone could buy Hempcrete without having to get any special papers because it was accepted with the building method and manual and trainings, people know what they're doing. I thought that the whole system was still too cumbersome and slow to actually bring out to the big masses. And that's the stage where it pretty much still is. It is a Hempcrete on sich with the monolithic wall system. It's fantastic, but it's a niche market. So how to bring that to the public? Then we have choice of going for prefabricated walls or a SIP or a block. And I called my company GeoSIP because in the end, a block that's a meter or 600 by 300 by 300 is like a structural insulated panel. So I worked on a system where we could combine a load-bearing system with a block and stack it up, interlock it, and go for your life and build your house quickly. And again, it's a pity that this doesn't work. So this is a little video of a house coming together. You'll have to go to my website to see it. Sorry, it's the that's PowerPoint for you. That's a play. No. Anyway, there you go. So let's talk about the GeoSIP or the Hempcrete block or Hempcrete property. Any questions so far? Is everyone on the same page? Yes?
Notice in the media recently that two multi-story apartments in New South Wales had the people who are living at the location because of cracking in the stuff. Hempcrete had that sort of problem.
Was that a Hempcrete building?
No, just arguing that sort of cracking.
Okay, that one in Melbourne. Was it in Melbourne?
I think so.
Yeah, great. Yeah. No, well, I was going to say if it was Hempcrete, they didn't use the old Hempcrete, Australia Hempcrete, because there is like a lot of systems. There's people that think they can do it themselves, and they work with fully tested materials. That looked fine in the beginning. Thank you very much. Thanks for the paycheck. Well, I built it myself. It's great to get the money and then see you later and run. And then later on, cracks are happening and drying is not equal and so on. So yeah, the right materials have to be used. Hempcrete can crack if you don't do the right thing, really. Yeah, there's just like anything, you've got to know what you're doing. There's a lot of varieties. Like anything. Yeah. All right. So the GeoSIP block is load bearing. It can go up to 2 stories. So we can build a 2-story house. Is a one system. Well, one material building system. GeoSIP block will have, because I don't have it here as yet, will have an outer coating around it, which is made out of hemp and lime, and it's just a stackable block, which is a system. So basically, meaning you stack your blocks up and you put the roof on top and plaster. That's it, finished. You don't have to render it or plaster it on the inside or paint it. It's a one walling system. So we talked about the carbon. It's got fantastic carbon properties. The wall goes up like in about 4 days. You can build a house because it's just stacking walls like a Lego system, really. Our GeoSIP system, we wanted to make, and we will make the window and door frames out of fiber reinforced polymers, which you see here. Wagner's is the only one, as far as I know, that makes it in Australia. Is anyone familiar with Wagner? Everyone seems to be. So, but I'm an agent for this, which I then call GeoB. That's right. And at one stage, we'll hemp fibers, the fiber reinforced polymers, so that our system will consist out of these window and door frames that will never rot. And as a builder, you replace your timber things; they'll go rotting. When you burn, you paint them, make them. This material will be. Don't you enjoy me talking about things now? These materials will last forever, and I think more than 50 years. I've been saying 50 years. This material will harden over time and will become rock eventually. They found a bridge made out of Hempcrete, which is total rock, stone right now, because the lime will continue carbonating the organic material, which is and wood. And can I get my samples back right away? It's not really bring them up. Yeah, termites are not interested because it's an alkaline system. It's lime. Thank you. Yeah, they don't need it. I don't have to worry about that. So we've got fantastic acoustic values, as you can see. This sample, I made this sample to bring around everywhere, and I made it so robust, and I tamped it, I rammed it a little bit, so it wouldn't fall apart. It's quite heavy, so this is much lighter. So that's just a Chinese takeaway container filled with hemp, boom, 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 bit of tamping, and that's it. Turn it upside down, leave it. So no ramming, no actions. So yeah, if you can imagine that this wall here, sound will definitely. That's a good one. And again, going into the signs of the wood. The wood has an open structure of lots of little holes in it. And all these particles together, including the air pockets that will be between the wood particles and the lime, will create fantastic insulation and sound insulation. We'll come back to the temperature change in a minute. So it's very energy efficient because Hempcrete is a fantastic mix between thermal mass and insulation. So what did I just say? I just said that's a block wall and it's fluffy insulation. By the way, that fluffy pink insulation, do you know that sooner or later this will become an illegal product to use? Because they found insulation in people's blood, bits of pink and yellow bats and so on. So we've got to look at different materials, as that's why we're here, to insulate our houses with, and perhaps the hemp insulation, if you make out of this, is a good one to start. So anyway, where was I? I was into the thermal mass and the insulation part of it. So imagine the sun will hit this wall here and heat up part of the wall. Because of the temperature in here and the humidity that is stored in the wall, as it being a hygroscopic walling system, a system that will allow the humidity to go in and out, absorb it and expel it. The heat won't get a chance to come to this part where inside the building is a constant temperature. So when we're talking about cold, it's the same story. The temperature, the constant temperature in here, which is in a Hempcrete building normally about 15 degrees without any heating and cooling, the cold won't get a chance to get through here because of the humidity regulation of the material. If we are coming to a point where we have a heat wave and the heat, the outside heat doesn't have a change during the night, then like any other building material, at some stage inside it will get hot because no material can withhold constant temperature without putting energy back into it. And then you can cool, or in the case of cold, heat the temperature here. And this insulation will work and will keep the temperature inside because of its thermal mass and because of its insulation properties at the same time. If this is a concrete wall, the temperature, as you know, will either be up and then will be very hard to cool down, which is normally down in the morning. Finally, this wall is cooled down. Now I've got to get up and start working. Or in the cold, there's no way you can heat a big fat concrete wall up with little heat. That's where this material is a fantastic alternative to raw materials. Okay, how am I going for time so far? Pretty good. Excellent. 5-10 minutes. So the block, which is perhaps there's another way I can quickly show the video anyway. But the block is a block with a tongue and a groove, and is a stackable system. And with that, we can build all these bits and pieces you can see here: high-rise developments, big places, small places, fire separation walls, hotels, hospitals, schools, and high-end houses and low-end houses. Now, what was I going to say? It has been a long time since I've had a talk, so I have to get into the talk mode again. What was I going to say? The properties about fire and R ratings. You probably want to hear some figures about those guys. All right. If you look up Hempcrete in general, you very often see a spectacular property of Hempcrete, and that is the fire resistance. See people with a flame, a naked flame, trying to burn the Hempcrete. So Hempcrete doesn't burn. It will smolder at some stage, but it does not burn. So a naked flame, a gas bottle, put it against there, make it nice and hot, we'll make it black and a bit red, and in 5 hours that will remain that way. So there's no change here, obviously, and your hand will still be fine here if the flame is positioned there. So Hempcrete does not burn. So then we come down to fire rating, which is the fire resistance load, which will be anywhere, depending on the wall thickness, from 60. That means 60 minutes to break through in the 4 places on fire, to 120, which is double time. There's many examples of houses that had Hempcrete walls in it, and the house would burn down, the roof, everything, but the Hempcrete walls would still stand, no problems. So that's the fire ratings. Then we come down to the insulation ratings. I'm looking at Phil. He's a teacher. He teaches people like me to actually do good presentations. But I'm all right. You shouldn't have been here. But anyway, that's all right. So what did I say? The insulation properties are of the GeoSIP block are anywhere from R4.5 to R4.8 rendered on both sides. So to my proof, what are the benefits of all of them? What are the down points on Hempcrete? The Hempcrete itself, as I mentioned before, is quite cumbersome. You've got to mix it up, you've got to get the mixer. You have to have a place where you store the wood, which comes in bags. You see my son holding it. That's got to be somewhere. Then the lime, you've got to mix it up, mix it with the mask. Basically a product made on site against a block, which is made in a factory. We have everything set up to get a factory going. Just need a few dollars. So if you guys want to chip in, only got $3 million to get that going. But it's we're ready to start manufacturing. The GeoSIP block, we can manufacture it in Europe. Found a factory that's willing to make our block and import it. That's not really how we want to start. May someone be absolutely completely stalled, I can imagine everyone over here, after this reading. We can look into getting a house going, but it's not really my aim to import building materials. Was it not for an investor that says, I first want to build a house and then probably yeah, well, a lot of talking. You didn't say much. Do you have any questions? Okay, let me start in the back, lady.
Sorry, just asking, regrowing the hemp.
Yep.
Is it quite high water use?
No, it's not. The hemp needs to to sprout like any other seed, and then in the vulnerable time, not be drowned like a lot of other plants. It will either wash or it will rot. But once it's up for about 300 mil, then it's quite robust. But I think he stood up to say something as well. Do you want to give me?
No, I was just about to do what you just did. Oh, we got any other questions?
All right.
Yeah, so you go.
Okay.
All right.
Yes.
I just want to compare to straw bale houses.
Yeah.
The straw bale house is much more organic.
Yeah.
Which I really like. Can you do that with your hemp?
Yes, I guess so. You've seen on the picture that we work with formwork there. That's the standard in situ building method of Hempcrete in general, globally. Formwork with studs from the inside and then framing. That formwork you can make it any way you like. You can have planks, you can make it shabby and make it crooked. It doesn't really matter as long as the principle is okay and there's a few technical parts of it, but it doesn't have to.
And how do you compare the comfort of all these and the function of that
With straw?
Yeah.
I think straw is a fantastic system that's globally been done here and there. The only thing is, I find straw bale too risky. It needs it needs to be done by someone that knows what they're doing and backed up very properly. With backing up, I mean stop humidity rising up into the wall, making sure there's no termites because they are interested in straw, no termite infestation, and then it's the managing of the building, which is quite hard because if there's a hole in the wall, humidity will go in there and stuff. So it's risky against this, which is really robust. It has a certain drying time which will last forever and then become stone. So within a month, if there's a constant drip somewhere, at some stage this lime will weaken off and create a hole on the wall. But after half a year, that is gone that hard that it won't do that as quick. And then after a year again, it will be harder and more. So yeah, I believe more in the Hempcrete against the straw. So this side here first, thank you. Yes, sir.
Is that a typical size block?
Yes, yeah. We made
get brick size.
We made this 250. So this is just a demo block. The GeoSIP block is 600 by 300 by 300.
Structurally, have you been able to compensate for bracing? Bracing calculation into your building design?
Building design, I like the question.
Yeah, the bracing and tie down.
Yeah.
Have you allowed for that?
So it's a pity I don't have a GeoSIP block here to go. That's Hempcrete, that's a GeoSIP block. But so the GeoSIP block, the system itself allows for tie down and bracing. This is done, as you would understand, with the stud wall. In the stud wall, you'll have steel bracing, which is then coated so it doesn't rust the lime, but that and the tie downs, of course. So we'll go to this side in a minute. Oh, we don't do that. So
Somebody else's job.
Too complicated. So the GeoSIP block also allows for cavities and a really easy and fast system to get your services in.
But when you have the blocks and lay them,
Yep.
essentially like
Which is a dry system. So we stack them up. We don't. There's no mortar.
do you build them internally?
Yeah, there's a system that we work with to make sure that everything is catered for what is needed inside. Yeah. So.
Do you think the formwork is used? Why is the formwork used for?
For this year, because if you imagine having porridge, and I want you to make a brick out of porridge, how are you going to make that? You can hold it until it dries up. No, the formwork in the hempcrete keeps the material in there. Yes.
Until it's set up. So your blocks which made in the factory.
Yep.
I guess are subject to different drying conditions.
Correct.
Or something like that.
Yep.
And so they don't require the length of drying or the length of going off, whatever that means.
Right.
Curing.
Yep.
The wall does.
Yeah. Well,
So if I might take that, does that mean the formwork there could disappear? Say after a year or something, the formwork within the wall could disappear.
oh, okay. Perhaps you misunderstood. So this formwork, we first create stud walls, then we have.
Sorry, I mean the stud wall, not the wall.
Oh, okay.
The stud wall could disappear.
No, in this system, not, because the hempcrete by itself doesn't have the MPH, doesn't have the strength to withhold the loading, the roof loading.
Okay, so what happens with the block?
The block has a system. We work with the system inside it to cater for the load bearing, load bearing
Okay. Block has an extra load bearing
system.
system in it.
Correct.
Next.
Well, which you mentioned something. There's a difference between a material going off and hardening over time. Going off is like glue, that's hard, that's gone off. But then for it to harden, even glue will take it has a certain peak time and then stabilize from there. So the same thing with hempcrete. Will go off, be really stiff and hard, and then after about 3 months, it has reached a very stable stiffness and hardness, and then it continues to harden over time. So it's a particular curve. So, and then 3 months. From there. Yeah. And what are you doing? Can I just ask? I'm curious. Are you a builder or a designer or curious? Okay. No, cool. Yep.
The other question was wall finishing. I noticed the houses look like
Correct. Yep. Well,
how do you finish the wall and putting that
regulation. Okay, I'll go back to the lime story. Why lime and why not cement? Because I've met a lot of people who are like, okay, yeah, and then lime or lime cement. Let's just use cement. So what happens? Cement is the same material, lime, essentially, but it's cooked at a way higher temperature, about 500 varies, but about 500 degrees higher, where the lime particles become really hard little balls, so to speak. They're pretty much glass balls. That's cement. While lime is not cooked that high and still has a capacity to dissipate and mingle within itself. The lime is more flexible. Okay, so therefore, to keep this wall hygroscopic or breathable, which is the word, a breathable wall. And funny enough, we only started to think about breathable stuff when people started to talk about breathable clothing. Suddenly, everything was breathable. Well, it was only because they made it from breathable, which was in the olden days clothing, non-breathable into plastic. And then they said, oh, there's breathable clothing, which is pretty much old-fashioned clothing, like cottons and wool and things. So same for the walls. It is important for a building to breathe. And we know that, and that brings me to the mold story. Condensation builds up in buildings and cannot go anywhere unless there is air systems that take away the humidity, or windows, or gas, or materials. Because we've all been in the rumpuses that are damp and it smells moldy and the carpet is wet, even though there's no necessarily water in there, but the humidity in concrete buildings, I'm just saying concrete or non-breathable buildings, go in there because we all breathe, there's liters of water going from our breath. And we'll just stay there because we can't go anywhere. unless there's duct systems and so on. So this the buildings have to be breathable in my, that's what I reckon, especially where people live. So we don't make it out of materials that are not breathable, so therefore it's fine. Or wood, if you want. I build a wood cabin made out of slabs. That's beautiful, but not everyone's got all that wood. Wood is breathable. So if we use this kind of material, then we have to put the coat it off or render it with a breathable render, which will be made out of lime or clay. It's like a straw rail. They don't put cement on there because that will, at some stage, brittle off and fall off and rot the straw rail on the inside. There's plenty of examples of a certain age where the old historical buildings in England, because we don't have them in England and in Europe, started to, they needed fixing up. The renders needed fixing. So people came with cement renders of old buildings, oak buildings and so on, and make all the historical buildings with straw infill and clay and lime and the whole lot. Put cement on it, looks very good for a few months, maybe a year, and then it starts to crack, and the timber inside rots. And these buildings are hundreds of years old. Because the cement will close off, will stop humidity to get out of the building, and the timber goes, I can't handle this, I'll better start rotting. So breathable buildings are important. One of the down points on concrete. Concrete.
Does that answer the question? Yes.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. I like that question. I always compare it to, imagine I've got a car and I want some new tires on it. I go, you want to go new tires? Can I get new tires? And I can't. You need profile on tires. What do you need profile? You slip away in the water and slip away. You need grip. Well, the same thing works with Hempcrete. It's a fluffy material, so to speak. It's quite lightweight. Then you go, well, to perform properly and to have these properties where the heat and the cold can't intrude through this side where it's insulating, you'll need a thickness of at least 250 mil. So then you say, I'll just make it more dense, but then you obviously give yourself the answer, then you make it a thermal mass, and then the insulation disappears. You brand the shit out of it, and the air pockets go, and you don't have it. So, yeah, the minimum is 250. It was there, we had container size tiny house, we built out of it, but we had 250 walls. And performance was great because it was not even finished, it was already warmer or cooler inside, cooler because it was hot at the time. And we still had open windows and everything. So, yeah, you can't do any concessions with the products out there. In Western Australia, they make 70 mil panel, which you combine with an air gap and eventually an insulation, and then have another 70 mil panel on the inside of it. So that's 140 mil plus an air gap, and then yeah, it functions like that as well. But the main thing is, for me, as a builder, I think, we work with iPhones, we've got all this technology, and we still build very cumbersome things that take a lot of time and have a lot of issues, and have proven not to actually perform the way that they are meant to. Keep on doing it, like a lot of food and preservatives. I think we should get together and or invest in this. No, should just put the money in it and make yourself food. Everyone with Hempcrete houses is really very happy, and they love it. And that's the main thing is the constant temperature, humidity regulation, and the way it feels. It feels really awesome.
I have a question, and then perhaps another question from the audience. I might call it a night. I don't think you mentioned cost, did you?
Cost. So now we're talking about tires. So what do you want? The El Chico Chinese tire, which starts wobbling even after balancing, or which is punctures by a needle, or quality and performance. And this is where the interesting part of us human beings don't want to make a session. We go like, oh yeah, I like it, but I prefer the cheaper one anyway, even though I know I have to pay more energy. I'm not as comfortable. I'll pay out for heating and cooling, depending on where you are. And I think the climate thing, the other guys before us, kind of clear when there's high lot of change. It's really worth to have a good insulation. So when it comes down to this system, Hempcrete system, it counts for 1.5 times a double brick linear house. Double brick house, two layers of brick with stuff all on the inside. And the GeoSIP block will counter just because of its speed and its the way it works. It counts for just a double brick house. Same price.
Yeah. Thanks, Johan. Another question?
Is there any way that you can do that as an owner builder and do it yourself?
So it's tricky, isn't it? Well, yes, you can. The Hempcrete, you can, but you want to engage with someone that has done it before. That's got the machine.
So is there a course or something?
Yeah, there used to be trainings. I got out of that. There's hemp masonry in Melbourne, and if you look it up online, there's a few people now that give them more professional training and instruct how to do it. But I would just engage a builder to build it and get the mates to help carry the stuff and hand it on. That's not really rocket science. And are there any builders here? How many builders are in the audience? There's one there. Your builder. Yeah. What do you think about this? Sounds interesting. Would you use it for your next house? Yeah. So it's with new products, just like the GeoSIP block, we need to have a really very strong way of marketing it and getting it to the people and make it look, which is what it is, really simple and fast, and skip the not willingness for Australians to change materials. If you look in Europe, there's so many materials out there, and people invest in it, get the factory happening, and they build houses with it. That's it, basta. They prove themselves, and then that factory will go. They'll just do it. Here in Australia, it's a little bit slow.
Mm. Look, the gentleman at the back just had one last question for the night. Sorry.
Sorry? That you can do with a batten screw or a batten screw, big screw, or with plugs or chemical anchors. Not a small screw because you need a bit more grip, a bit more body, so long, to hang TV or anything else. It's definitely possible. And if you really have heavy stuff, you can go all the way to the studs.
Mm-hmm. And besides that, if you hang around long enough, it becomes rock.
That's right.
And you'll fix something to it. Can I just, I think we'll probably wind it up now, if that's all right.
Yeah, that's fine.
Folks, and you're going to get an opportunity, as I said, with Geoff to talk to Johan after as well. I was interested in the comment about, Nimbin, they have classes. I thought they might be using a different variety of cannabis or hemp at that stage. I don't know.
Well, it's also a different variety of binder, which it's all about this binder. We had a contract with a French company that had a binder that's been researched and has been proven and tested very thoroughly. So we took that on instead of making our own and see what happens. Because that with making your own, you requires doing your job properly. Sorry, but then the hemp wood, well, on that point, marijuana plant, hemp wood is no different to the industrial plant, really. So anyone that has any anything left from the plantations can send it to us and we'll manufacture it. Anyway, thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks, Johan. Just before you go,